There you go.
Why don't I start over?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to talk about a book written by David McCullough about 40 years ago. It describes life before the canals were built, and then it tells us three different canals. First, the Suez Canal, and I'll talk about it very briefly. And then secondly, the French Panama Canal, and that's going to be the thrust of tonight's story. And then the next time I'll talk about episode 2 will be the American Canal. Panama, which sits just north and west of Colombia, was not a separate country when all of this was going on. It was part of Colombia. It was a province called New Granada. I'm going to talk about two cities, the one up at the northern end, which is on the Caribbean, Colón, and then the one at the southeastern end, which was Panama City. Before the canals, by the middle of the 19th century, the world was constrained by two primary factors. One was the speed of travel. Steam had just been developed. Most travel was occurring by wind. The wealthy developing countries, and now that's mostly Europe and the eastern United States, were thousands of miles from their suppliers and their customers. The Industrial Revolution had happened, but mercantilism was limited by accessibility. There had been many surveys taken in Central America, but all of the obstacles and the plans that they drew up were very speculative. America was still recovering from the Civil War, but by the middle of the 19th century, two major canals had already been built in North America. Now, why the canal? Looking at this map, you can see that without the Panama Canal, to get from the east coast to the west coast was an 18,000-mile journey, taking upwards of 4 to 5 months. The same thing was true in Europe. To get from those objectives, and I just kind of generally circle the area of the Spice Islands and whatnot, but also India. To get there from Europe was a journey of 16,000 miles. So you can see that there were real commercial benefits to cutting through those two canals, Suez and Panama. Now,
I'll show you what's going on.
Pardon me?
Hey, Norm, mute yourself.
First, I want to talk about two canals that had already been built in North America. First was the Erie Canal. It was built to create a water route from New York City to the Great Lakes, 360 miles from the Hudson River in Albany to Lake Erie in Buffalo. It was built in 1825, and at the time it was built, it was the second longest canal in the world. The only canal that was longer was the Grand Canal in China, which was somewhere close to 1,000 miles in length. It had actually been proposed during the revolution or right after the revolution. And after many political chicaneries and whatnot, construction began in 1817. The canal opened on October the 26th, 1825. It had 34 numbered locks. The locks and the canal were operated by the state. It was replaced by the New York Barge Canal in the early 20th century, and now it's primarily a tourist attraction. However, in 2012, their annual cargo volume still was in the 40,000 ton range. So there's still a fair amount of commercial traffic that goes from here all the way over to the Hudson River.
George, is that on the Erie Canal or is that the replacement?
It's on the New York Barge or the Barge Canal.
Okay.
The Welland Canal is a ship canal that was built in Ontario, Canada It connects Lake Ontario with Lake Erie. The first Welland Canal, and there have been more than one, was actually built by a Canadian company, and they opened it in 1829. It has subsequently been modified 3 different times as they have improved, expanded, widened, deepened the canal. Today, it's a key part of the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes Waterway. It is how you get to the St. Lawrence Seaway. You have to bypass Niagara Falls. There are 8 locks in the Welland Canal. 7 of them are at the Niagara Escarpment, if you know very much about that. The 8th is a guard lock. The depth of the canal is 25 feet. It has locks 775 feet long. They actually change in elevation 584 feet from one lake to the other, mostly in order to get across the escarpment. It accommodates all of the Great Lakes traffic to the ocean. It's open except for about 2 to 3 months every year. So by 1860, America had some experience with building major canals. Then a very interesting occurrence hit the country, the gold rush. Gold was found at Sutter's Mill in 1848. It brought 400,000 people to California from the eastern United States and abroad. It was a magnet. There was just one major problem. How do you get there from the eastern United States? There was no easy way to do that. There was, most seekers traveled by sea. The sailing voyage around South America took 5 months. An alternative was to sail to the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama and take canoes and mules through the jungle, through the isthmus. You saw it a little earlier. It was about a 40-mile trip, but it was no easy 40-mile trip. But then you had to wait for a ship that would be sailing to San Francisco. Neither of these was really satisfactory. This was part of the impetus to build the Transcontinental Railroad about 15 years later. Now, talking about railroads, and I thought this was really interesting. I did not know this. In 1846, the United States signed a treaty with Colombia, and that authorized the United States to build a railroad or a canal at the isthmus. What we did in order to get that was we guaranteed open transit, that we would not try to control traffic through this vehicle. In 1849, the Panama Canal Railroad was formed. Studies were completed. The construction challenges just to build a railroad were immense. They experienced the same problem that they experienced later on when they tried to build the canal. But in 1850, ground was broken. One of the problems that they had was health. Cholera, yellow fever, and malaria took a deadly toll on workers on the railroad. They had to build a bridge across the Chagras River. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on about this river. They had to dig a furrow through the Continental Divide, and this is where the Continental Divide is. That furrow was 2,500 feet long and 40 feet deep. It was finished in 1855. It was 47 miles long. It cost $8 million. And just to give you a comprehension of what $8 million in 1855 translates to today, It translates to $2 billion. That is 8 times the original estimate that they thought it was going to take to build that railroad. The railroad was tremendously profitable. Soon that railroad all by itself was the most valuable stock on the US stock exchange. Now, let's start talking about canal site studies. Grant in 1870 commissioned a number of exploratory studies of canal possibilities. They were really looking at 5 different sites. The one in Panama, this one, the one at Lake Nicaragua, this one at the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, that's in Mexico here, a Darien route and a Gulf of Uribe route, both in eastern Panama. 7 American expeditions were completed in the period that should be 1870, 1875. Their conclusions, this is the American studies, was that Nicaragua was the preferred location to build the canal. That is going to come back again, not only in this story, but in the story of the American Canal. They stayed with that all the way up until the decision to do something different. There were also a number of European studies, primarily French and German. None of these explorations included any serious engineering considerations. Nobody really concerned themselves with doing any kind of soil sampling, any kind of testing of what it might take to build these canals. I don't know exactly why they didn't do that, but they were all more of a layout and a direction than they were looking at the topographical content. In addition, and this is really serious, few studies were made of the climate, weather, or health conditions. Even though the railroad, as it went through, and it went through right here at option 1, even though that railroad had terrible health problems, they did not do any serious studies of health conditions. Talk a little bit about a gentleman that you may have heard the name of, but might not know too much about, named Pierre de Lesseps. He was a French diplomat and administrator responsible for the construction of the Suez Canal. He was neither an engineer nor was he an administrator. What he was a huckster. He made P.T. Barnum look like a piker. He could sell anything to anybody. He was born into a family of career diplomats. He went into the diplomatic service and he was posted to Tunisia and Egypt. While he was in Egypt, he became friends with Said Pasha, who was the son of the Viceroy of Egypt. In 1854, Said Pasha became the Viceroy. De Lesseps went to Egypt and he was granted, really just because he and Pasha were good friends, authorization to build the Suez Canal. It had been talked about, but no one had ever gotten serious enough about it to even get Egyptian authorization to do anything. After many challenges, the Suez Canal was finished in 1869. De Lesseps by then was a 65-year-old man, but he soon was promoting a similar canal in Panama. After insurmountable challenges, the Panamanian effort failed. He was held responsible and he soon died. Now, a little bit about the Suez Canal. I don't know how much you know about it. It was built by the Suez Canal Company. That was a company that was formed by de Lesseps between 59 and 69. It was 100 miles long and 26 feet deep. Napoleon Bonaparte, 60 years earlier, had seriously considered such a canal, but he abandoned it. It had many skeptics, including the Brits. It was funded by individual investors, not by a country. It is a sea level canal, and that's important. The excavation was all digging. More than 1,500,000 people worked on that canal over the space of that 10 years. They removed 250 million cubic feet of material. They ran into technical, political, and financial problems, but they overcame them all as much as anything else because of de Lesseps. He was just the kind of person to whom people could not say no. He was enthusiastic. He would strong-arm somebody if he needed to. The final cost was twice the original estimate, $100 million. $100 million in that day and age was $25 billion in today's currency. That's what it would have cost to build the canal if you built it today, although you might be less because we've got more sophisticated equipment. He sold shares to individuals, and the values of those shares gradually increased. It was extremely successful as an investment. The canal was owned by the British government, but these European shareholders, mostly French and British, owned the company which operated it until July of 1956. That's when Nasser nationalized the canal. Now, the 1870s. In the 1870s, the Franco-Prussian War erupted. The Second French Empire collapsed, and the Third French Republic commenced. There was even at that, and I didn't know about this, there was a civil war in the city of Paris during this era. So France was on its heels, and France needed something to regain its posture as a world power. De Lesseps turned his attention to Central America. He had one of his subordinates sign a treaty with Colombia in 1877, which gave France the rights to build a canal in the province of Panama. There is an organization called the Geographic Society of France. They sponsored a conference, and that conference included people from all over the world, including the United States, Great Britain, anybody who was interested in what are we going to do in Panama, or what are we going to do really in Central America. They were not just considering Panama at that conference. At that conference, the United States recommended Nicaragua. There were no in-depth studies of explorations, but the society chose Panama. And if you read about how that happened, it was because of de Lesseps. He had a lot of clout among the people who were involved in this society. It would be roughly parallel to the railroad that I talked about earlier. France would be the proprietor of this canal. There were only a few questions. What kind of canal was to be built? How much would it cost? Where was the money going to come from? You know, just small things.
George,
Sir,
I'm looking at the map of Panama and Nicaragua. Why did the United States pick that country? Because it looks like it would be a hell of a lot more work involved to make a canal through there than it would Panama.
you're going to have to wait for episode 2 to get the full answer. But first of
All right.
all, there was a large lake in the middle of it that you could use. Secondly, it had the most powerful senator in the U.S. Senate. who wanted to go to Nicaragua because it was closer to New Orleans, Mobile. I mean, it was a political football, but they had a number of good reasons. But you'll hear more if it's episode 2. And by the way, the picture that's on the right that shows that great big lake in Panama, that was not there when they built the canal. That's the only good picture that I could get of the topography. The terrain that they were going to take was a mixture of tropical vegetation, swamps, and unknown soil composition. The isthmus was about 50 miles from the north shore to the south shore. It crossed the continental divide, and that's actually up in here. And like I said, this lake was not there then, at an elevation of 130 feet. That's how high the continental divide was at that point. That's why they chose Panama. That's the lowest point they could find to get across. There was also a major river that flowed from the southern slope from in here that eventually became, this is Gatun Lake. Eventually it was dammed and became Gatun Lake, but it flowed to Panama City. The plan was to build a dam across this river, not to form this lake particularly, but to control the river's flow so that it didn't ruin the canal during the wet season. That never happened, by the way, in the French plan. Now, there were 2 cities. One was Cologne, and that's on the northern shore, and Panama City. Of the 2, Panama City was the better developed, but neither one met European standards of what a city ought to include. Cologne had only been there 20-something years. It was the Atlantic terminal of the Panama Railroad. It was founded by the United States. It was built on a marshy inlet, Manzanillo Island. Part of the island had to be drained so they could even erect permanent buildings on it. And this city, Cologne, was going to be where everything had to go through to get to the canal. Much of Cologne actually was burned during the Colombian Civil War. I'm going to talk a little bit about that Civil War. That happened during the French construction period. Panama City was an older city. It was about 300 years old, and it had a modest level of refinement. It even had some nice hotels. Interestingly, it became the headquarters of the construction effort, even though the majority of the construction effort had to be done on the northern side of the canal. Panama City was on the wrong coast. All of the equipment, all of the labor, all of the supplies would have to come through Cologne. Those 2 cities are pretty important to this whole story. Now, there's a river called the Chagras River and the proposed canal. This was the proposed canal that the French were going to build. This is the Chagras River. And if you'll remember, the earlier map that I showed a lake here. That was not there at the time construction started. And actually, they didn't plan to build a lake. It's the largest river in Panama. It's 120 miles long. It was a major factor in construction. It's a very seasonal river. It's a torrent in the rainy season and tame in the dry season. It was a major obstacle in the construction of the Panama Railroad. So they knew about this river, and they knew what kinds of problems it had when they built the railroad. The railroad bridge, now that's the bridge to get from up here at Cologne down to Panama City. The railroad bridge washed out when de Lesseps was inspecting the site. So he got some hard information about what kind of problems they might have if they paid attention to the river. He ignored them. As I said earlier, the French had planned to dam the river, and their plan to dam the river wasn't so much to build a lake as it was to control the flow of the river and not have that give them trouble with the canal they were going to build. This is the most significant feature of the Panama Canal. It's called the Kulibra Cut. Their design was to dig a V shape, okay, 375 feet deep and 1/4 mile wide. It's at the Continental Divide. By the time they finished, or didn't finish, it had expanded 4 times in terms of the width at the top. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why. If you can see here, they were cutting their slopes almost vertical. That did not work. They did not have enough of the right type of equipment to excavate. It was too small and too light. They did not have the capability to move spoil away from the site. And that's what eventually killed them. The spoil disposal system was poorly organized and poorly managed. What they did was they built dump areas on the side of the slopes, and they slid back into the canal or the channel when the rains came. Drainage ditches were built parallel to the canal, and they helped. But the deeper the excavation, the more they went down into the, and they had to remember, this is a sea level canal, so you've got to go down to 25 or 35 feet below the levels of the ocean. The deeper the excavation, the worse the slides. The only way they could figure out how to contend with that was to widen at the top the slope. It doubled the amount of excavation that was required. That plan, i.e. the sea level canal, was unmanageable. Ultimately, the problem of the slides is what doomed the canal that the French were trying to build. They could not control it. And by the way, I think I'm going to find this out as I go through the American Canal. The primary benefit of the American plan was the use of railroads to take the spoil away from the danger area. So the man who built the American Canal was a railroad expert, and he knew how to get track laid, spoil areas set up, back and forth of the digging that had to go on. This is what a dredge looked like in 1880. It was steam driven. You can see how, I don't know how else to say it. You can see how antiquated it looks. This is how they were going to dig a canal with 275 million cubic yards of spoil to be taken out. Management, interesting story. The chief engineer, now I'm going back to when they were making the decision of what to do and where to do it, of the French Department of Bridges and Highways, was the only one among the French delegation who had any construction experience. He made a forceful presentation in favor of a lock canal. This proposal included the basic design features that were later used by the United States when America built the Panama Canal. Instead, with a grand show, and I mean it was a show from de Lesseps, they chose to build the sea level canal. On August the 17th, 1879, the Compagnie Universelle des Canals de Panama was formed with de Lesseps as its president. To do the work, he contracted a company called Kulibra Cut, who had done the work in the Suez Canal. They lasted just a little more than a year. And then they realized they were in a situation they did not want to be in, and they terminated their contract. For the next 4 years, work was done by a number of contractors under the supervision of the company itself. And who you see on the right is the chief engineer of the company. His name was Dingler, with a group of French engineers. This is just a data point. Within a month after they got to Panama, 13 of their 30 engineers had died of yellow fever. It was not a healthy place to work. But this is the man who supervised the canal for several years. Interestingly, he brought his family to Panama, his wife and children. They all died of yellow fever. And then he quit. In 1888, the sea level project was abandoned for a lock canal. Once the lock canal was functional, what they were going to do was deepen it to make a sea level canal. But it was too late and work was stopped. A little bit of information about yellow fever and malaria. In addition to technical issues, the French Canal was built in the breeding grounds of 2 deadly tropical diseases. Malaria was bad enough, but malaria had been around a long time, and generally speaking, it was debilitating more than it was deadly. But yellow fever was different. It caused fever, headaches, back pain, thirst, and then black vomit because of internal bleeding. It would progress to kidney failure, seizure, and eventually death. The French thought that these 2 diseases were because of decaying waste and garbage. They were assumed to be the causes of the diseases. So they cleaned up the waste and garbage areas. However, yellow fever is spread by the bite of an infected mosquito, as is malaria. There were no serious efforts to eradicate the mosquitoes. They actually did things that promoted the growth of mosquitoes because they didn't realize the danger. The death toll of the canal group was more than 20,000 men. But it wasn't just those who died, it was people who were sick and stayed sick. And the impact on the working morale was severe. Hospitals. The French built 2 very, very good hospitals. One in Cologne, this one, and the other on Ancon Hill facing the Pacific Ocean. They were well equipped. They had the best equipment and medicines of the time. They were staffed with excellent doctors and surgeons. However, they were poorly managed, under contract by the French Sisters of Charity, who didn't know very much about medicine. The facility at Ancon, this one here, was an 800-bed facility. It cost over $5 million. $5 million is something on the order of $2 billion today. 35 years later, when the Americans, by the way, took over both of these hospitals, Gorgas, who was in charge of the project, said it was the finest medical facility that he had ever seen. It was a very, very well-built hospital. The facility at Cologne cost $1 million. Now, here's an interesting little statistic. Of the 20,000 that I quoted earlier, 5,000 deaths occurred in hospital. Most of the deaths 3 times at the very least, and then statistically, they don't know because most of these people were illiterate day workers, but they used it 15,000 as the target number, occurred outside of hospital walls. And one of the reasons was if you were put in the hospital, you had to pay for your own care. And the cost in the hospital was more than what you were getting paid to do the work. So an awful lot of workers couldn't afford to go into the hospital. So they died in the towns, died in their bed, so to speak. Talked a little earlier about the Panama insurrection. In March of 1885, Colombia, remember this was a Colombian province, reduced its presence in Panama because they had to send troops to fight rebels in Cartagena. This led to insurgency in Panama. The United States Navy was sent to keep order because we had signed a treaty with Colombia in 1846, part of the Monroe Doctrine, I believe, saying that if there was trouble in this area, the American Navy would come to the rescue. By April, American ships started arriving in Colón. A force of Marines was landed in Panama City. Now, this is interesting. In response to the American intervention, Chile sent a ship called a protected cruiser, the Esmeralda, to Panama City. And their purpose in doing that, so now we got another country involved in it, was to stop an eventual annexation of Panama by the United States. Allegedly, the Esmeralda could have destroyed our whole Navy ship by ship and never be touched. It was the most modern ship, the most modern warship in the world. Interestingly, it was built by the British for the Chilean Navy. It had 10-inch guns. It had six-inch guns, and especially it had deck armor 2 inches thick. It was the fastest ship in the world at that, fastest warship in the world at that time, with a speed of 18 knots. Fortunately, by the time it got there, the situation in Panama had been settled. The Americans withdrew from Panama City, which then was reoccupied by the Colombian government at the end of April. To put it mildly, this was not beneficial to construction. Now, how'd they pay for this? You might be interested in this. Estimates for the sea level canal were roughly somewhere between $100 million and $200 million, all told. $100 million is $25 billion in today's money. Among other things, it included the purchase of the Panama Railroad and all the costs associated with excavation. The project was funded with the sale of private shares. Remember the company Universal? They started with a sale of shares at $60 million. There would be 6 subsequent share sales. As costs went up, they kept needing more money. They kept selling more shares. The last was a proposed lottery sale. And I hate to tell you this, but if I read about what the lottery sale was supposed to do, it didn't make any sense to me. But it would have brought the total funded to more than $300 million. It failed. As a result, the company was declared bankrupt when the lottery sale failed. Now I'm going to digress and tell you a little bit about somebody whose name you've heard, but you might not know this about him. Gustave Eiffel. He was a French civil engineer. He was a graduate of the prestigious engineering school of France. He is best known for the Eiffel Tower. That was built for the 1889 exposition in Paris. He was also involved in erecting the Statue of Liberty in New York City. So he was a very prominent engineer on the world stage. He had a major role in the French Panama Canal. When the plan changed to one that was going to use locks, Eiffel was contracted to design and build the locks that were going to go in the canal. He'd only been working on the project for about a year when the company suspended payment in December of 1888. Shortly thereafter, the company went into liquidation. His reputation was damaged when he was implicated in the financial and political scandal which followed. He was charged with raising money under false pretenses for misappropriation of funds. In 1893, he was found guilty on the charge, and this is criminally guilty, on the charge of misuse of funds. This is just a Jerry Pala digression. The Eiffel Tower. Work on the Eiffel Tower started in 1887. It was completed in less than 2 years. It is 1,060 feet tall. It's the same height as an 81-story building. It has been since it was built, the tallest structure in Paris. Its base is a square 400 feet on each side. It was the centerpiece for the 1889 Exposition Universelle, which was a centennial of the French Revolution. That's why they built the Eiffel Tower. Eiffel, being a shrewd businessman, started a separate company to manage the tower. He put up half of the money to build this tower, and he was going to get the money back from the operation of it. Aftermath. How did all this end? The grand plan turned out to have no foundation. Pun intended. 800,000 French citizens lost some or all of their savings. This is an interesting little tidbit. In 1892, it was discovered that 100 French deputies, that's their equivalent of representatives and senators, had been bribed about the canal. The French government then fell. They had to bring in a whole new government. In 1893, de Lesseps, his son, and a number of others, including Eiffel, were found criminally guilty, but they served no time in jail. And if you read about that, it's not real clear why they were found guilty and then not put in jail. A new French group renewed the effort in 1894, but it soon failed also. In 1902, now up until 1902, the United States still wanted to build a canal in Nicaragua, purchase the assets of the company. Originally, it was offered to the highest bidder for $109 million. But through a number of different transactions, and I'll talk about that when I talk episode 2, the United States bought the assets for $40 million. That included the railroad. And the United States resumed work under a revised plan. And that's the French Panama Canal. Any questions?
Hey, George, a sea level canal with the tides and all, wouldn't there have been a hell of a current through that? Sea level?
I'm not sure what the tide is, you know, right at the midpoint of and you know more about this than I do, Earl, the tides are really high the further away you get from the equator. But when you're pretty close to the equator, I think that they are fairly low. But you're right, there would be some tidal concern. I don't know that they even considered that, to be honest. Since they never got there, it didn't matter.
Interesting point I heard just before, but if you look at your map, and actually go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you go from the west to the east in the canal.
That's correct. Actually, southwest, I guess is the.
Yeah, southwest, but you go some.
But the big point is going to be this lake. This is Gatun Lake. We built Gatun Lake with a dam. That's that's probably, and I'm not trying to have a spoiler alert, but I think that's what you'll find is the major improvement that the American plan had to offer. Now, the locks were already in the last French plan. They just never got, they had pissed away so much money. They spent $275 million and had nothing to show for it. Anybody else still there?
Still here, George. We're
George,
trying to
are
think
you
of some
gonna
good
cover that
questions, but we,
canal that has been built in the, I don't know, last 10 years or so? You gonna
What?
talk about that at all?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Are you gonna talk about the, you know, the newest canal that's been built, and I want to say 10, 15 years ago?
I'll bring it up. I don't know anything about it.
Okay, I just wondered, is there a map that would show the route so you could see the old canal and the new canal, that kind of stuff? The old canal is still in service, isn't that right? Or not?
Yeah. John,
What?
didn't they build a new, the Chinese now own and operate that, right?
I have no idea.
And they built one that's wider than the original.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's a lot bigger. Yeah.
When you
Yeah,
say
I
they
saw something on TV once.
Panama yet,
I'm thinking, wasn't it Jimmy Carter who gave up the Panama Canal? Gave it
Yes.
up to the Chinese?
yes. I
Yeah.
don't know if he gave it up. He gave it back to the Panamanians. They then probably sold it to the Chinese. I didn't know the Chinese owned it.
They
I don't
either
think
own it or
the Chinese
operate it.
own
One
it.
of them.
They operate it. They have a contract with Panama to operate it.
Yeah.
Well,
George,
I think,
how bad was the investment that the French made hurt their economy?
Badly. Very, very badly. I don't know. Remember now, the French government was not who was paying for this. It was shareholders. It was mom and pop. There were 800,000 shareholders. That's who paid for this. And they used their savings.
Yeah, that's the point, really. There was real money instead of somebody just, you know, turning on a printing press and running money.
That's
You know.
correct. And they all lost their shirts.
but the people who built the Suez Canal, that was also private and they made money, didn't they?
Yes, they did. That's what drew them into the Panama Canal. The Suez Canal was very successful. The amount of money that a shareholder was getting from the Suez Canal was immense. So he had in his one hand a story that he could say, look at here, here's what I know and here's what I've done. I'm going to do it again. Join me and make more money.
Well, he didn't have, in the Suez Canal, George, I don't think they had the yellow fever and
did not.
malaria.
No, they did not. And it didn't occur to him that there was differences between the two areas.
Hey, George, excellent presentation. Let me ask you for part two, are you going to kind of consider towards the end of the presentation, perhaps some strategic scenarios in case we get into some conflicts again? Because we certainly used it in World War II and Vietnam and all that, Korea, to transport East Coast ships through the Panama Canal. I know we went through in the early 70s, headed west. So I didn't know whether you had that as part of your presentation.
Part of it is going to be the geopolitical motivation for us building the canal. Teddy Roosevelt and crowd was very interested in the Pacific Ocean being the American pasture. He wanted to be able to control most of the Pacific. By then, if you'll remember, the Philippines were American. So we were in a position to build a great deal geopolitically in the West, but we couldn't get our Navy back and forth. That was a major driver to the American building that canal.
Yeah.
Now, as far as lately is concerned, I'll have to look for information. I don't know. I haven't gotten that far, by the way. I've only done section 1. Section 2 is still in the Ethernet somewhere.
Hey, Bill, are you suggesting that there might be a conflict later on with China?
Well, yeah, I think we got one going on now. It's just a matter of, it's just a matter of how that's going to heat up, or if it does any more than what we've got. But sure, I think we'll certainly have some face-offs there, just like we've had with the Russians in the Mediterranean and around the world, that kind of thing. So, yeah, we'll have something.
Okay, guys.
Thank you.
George, thank you. That was very good. We'll see you tomorrow morning.
Okay.